Now, I wanted to finish off my slides on E2E testing, and then I'll talk a little bit about the assignment spec for assignment number two. So just for clarity now, I am continuing on this set of slides here. And so I introduced E2E testing yesterday, and we started looking at the particular framework that we're going to use, which is called Cypress. And maybe what I'll do is I'll also start up the Movies app, which you are using in this week's lab to demonstrate writing Cypress tests, or as we call them, Cypress specs. So if I go to the Movies app, which is not that, I can close that off. And I'm just going to start it up. Obviously, you're very familiar with it, but there are slight differences between the version of the Movies app that I have and the one that you're developing in the lab, as far as I'm aware, anyway. Okay, so this is the home page. This is the title that I have on it, Discover Movies. And it displays, as we know, it displays 20 movies from the Discover endpoint. Now, I think in your case, the card here on the top left, you use that for filtering. Whereas in this version of the application, the way I do filtering is if I click this uh, button on the top right, then it opens up the filtering side menu and you can do your filtering from there. Okay, I think that's really the only difference. So if I select the genre, it just displays those movies. Now, because there is a difference between the way I do filtering in this app and the way you do it in the app that you're developing in Web App Dev 2, I'm just going to leave out the testing of the filtering side. It's not that important anyway. And also, as we know, what we can do is we can select favorites, and the way we select a favorite is by clicking this heart symbol in a card. And when we select a favorite, then this icon or graphic appears at the top of the card. But I selected the second one there. I'll try and select it again. And if we navigate to the favorites page, then we just see the ones that we've selected. Okay, so that's pretty much how the Movies app works. And there's some other features as well, like getting reviews and writing your own reviews and all of that. Now, I'm just going to focus on, let's say, testing this page here and also testing the favorites feature. And also, thirdly, testing the basic navigation that's available to us. So the way, if we click the more info here, we go to the movies detail page. And also I've got navigation links here on the top uh, in the page header. In terms of uh, the Cypress tests, we saw yesterday that when you start up your Cypress framework for the first time, you do that from the command line because it has a command line interface that allows us to run our tests and also run the Cypress GUI. Maybe just start up the Cypress GUI. If I open up a second terminal, you need to have the Movies app running before you can run your tests, obviously. So I've opened up a second terminal. And from here, if I type the command npx Cypress. Okay, so where I was in VS Code, which I need to restart again. And I need to start up the Cypress GUI interface. Select E2E testing, select Chrome. Now, before I click this button here, you can see what I'm showing here now are all the applications that I have currently running on my laptop. So on the extreme left, I have the Cypress GUI. That's what we're looking at. Then I have VS Code. Then I have an instance of my Chrome browser and some other stuff as well. But when I come back to here and I select, yeah, I want to run my tests in Chrome. And I look at what applications have I running. You can see that I've actually got two instances of Chrome. I have the one on the extreme left and I have this one here. The one on the extreme left is the one that Cypress has um, started for me. And this instance of the Chrome browser is the one that it's going to use to run my Cypress tests because I said that your Cypress tests run inside the browser. And I've chosen Chrome. So it's actually, and it has also loaded a, um, it has loaded a Cypress runtime application in this browser, and that's what you're actually seeing here. Yeah. And for example, it's actually listing the Cypress test files or test specs that I have for this project. And these four test specs, they correspond to, if I look in my VS Code, they correspond to the four, one, two, three, four files that I have in my E2E folder within the Cypress uh, folder of my project. And by just clicking and it's inside in these spec files, that's where my testing code is. And we had a brief look at how we structure Cypress testing code yesterday, but we need to talk a little bit more about it today. To run a test, I go back to the browser instance that's actually running the Cypress runner, and I just click on it. So let's say I want to run the favorites tests. It actually works through the code, and on the right, you see it uh, flicking through the various pages that it needs to navigate as it's running my tests, and it's interacting with the browser page as well because it's selecting favorites and all that kind of stuff. Okay, if I go back to my slides, maybe. So let's see where we can pick it up. Yeah, so to run the Cypress uh, graphical user interface or GUI. This is the command that we enter on the command line, and I've just shown you that. Okay. Test execution, then I've shown you how to do that. You select the particular from here, you select the particular spec that you want to run and you click on it and it steps through the code and runs each line of code in the test spec. And as it's executing each line of code, it actually shows you on the right what's currently happening in your browser. You know, and ideally, what we want is we talk about green bar, red bar in relation to testing in general. Green bar means your test has passed. Red bar means that there's an error has occurred. Typically, the error might be that there was an expectation statement in your test code that doesn't match what actually happened in your application. And so typically that might be in the case of testing a browser-based app, maybe in your test code, you make a statement that a certain something there should be a certain element that's displaying on the web page, and that element is not displaying, for example. But if your test runs complete without any errors, then we get what's called a green bar outcome. And that's actually kind of what you're visually seeing here. So that's what we're ideally looking for. Now, the next thing I suppose really is actually writing our tests code. And what I'm saying on this slide here is because in order to write our Cypress tests, we essentially have to fully understand the structure of the web page or pages that make up our web application. And by that, I mean we need to know the actual HTML, the detailed HTML that is being used to generate any particular page. Now, the thing when you're writing React apps is, okay, you write your React code, and then when you run your React app, it actually generates the HTML that makes up the what actually appears on the screen. Now, in addition, you are using the Material UI CSS library together with the React framework. And that Material UI CSS library turns out that it actually generates quite a lot of HTML behind the scenes for you. And that's what I'm showing you here on this screenshot. So maybe if I just go back to my original browser, which is this one here. And if you open up the developer tools and select the element tab, which is this one here. And when you select that, what it'll show you is the HTML corresponding to what's currently being displayed on the screen. Sorry, now there's just stuff getting in my way here. So if I select the element tab, and I also want to get rid of that. And if you just click on this little button here, and then as you move the mouse around the screen, it shows you the corresponding part of the HTML for that part of the screen on the right. So let's supposing let's say I try and mouse over this here. And if I click it, then it brings me to the particular part of the HTML that's generating what I clicked on, which is this little paragraph here. Yeah. Now you can see like that there's an awful lot of divs appearing here. And those divs actually weren't in your React code at all. And these divs are actually being generated by the Material UI library behind the scenes for you. And it's really this HTML, this is what we need to understand in order to be able to write our Cypress test code, because we said Cypress was web app framework agnostic. Cypress doesn't know anything about React or any of its competing frameworks. All Cypress understands is HTML. Now, as I said, because we are using React, and in particular, we're using the Material UI CSS library, which together they generate the HTML for the web pages that make up your application. Then it's really the HTML that we need to fully understand before we can write our Cypress tests. And so what I'm showing you here is a way of discovering the HTML corresponding to the various pages that make up our Movies app. And you'd have to spend some time. Like Material UI has certainly complicated matters because it does actually generate a lot of HTML for you behind the scenes. Now, let's look at another thing. Supposing I want to find out where's the HTML that generates this heart symbol here. So again, if I just click on this icon here and move the mouse down towards a particular part of the page and click it, then we can see on the right that it's an SVG HTML element, and that's if we zoom out from that a little bit, that's contained within a button. If I click the button, then it works kind of both ways. If you click a piece of the HTML on the right, it shows you the corresponding part of the page that relates to. So if I've clicked on button here, and it's highlighting this here for me. Let's see if we pick another one. I just click this div, for example. The div that I've clicked here now it's wrapping, seems to be wrapping this entire card here. Yeah. And I'd have to open it up to drill down into it. So you need to study, I guess what I'm trying to say is you need to study this HTML in order to fully understand the structure of your pages, and then that's what drives the writing of your testing code. And admittedly, it has been complicated by the inclusion of Material UI. So maybe the next thing I should do is if I just go back and look at one test case. If we look at the favorites, let's say. Well, not. Let's look at the base test. Now, there isn't really any advice from Cypress's perspective as to how you should group your test cases. When we talked about unit testing, we said you should have one test file per unit. That typically related to one test file per class in your code. When it comes to E2E testing, there isn't a nice simple relationship between a file and a particular part of your application, So I've decided I'm going to have a base Cypress test file, which all its intent is to check that the basics of your Movies app is working. And by that I mean, for example, in the home page, it displays the page header and it displays 20 cards, because remember in the home page it should display 20 movies from the Discover API. So I just checked to see that there are 20 cards being displayed on the home page. So if I look at this file, And we're familiar with these describe blocks. Now, I'm going to skip over before. There's a before block and there's a before each block. I didn't mention the before block to you when I was talking about Mocha. A before block, the code that you put in a before block, that executes once uh, only, whereas a before each block executes before each it block. Now, I'm going to skip over what's happening in my before block, and for now, the before each block is easy to see what it's actually doing. It's essentially going back to the home page every time before it executes any of the nested it blocks. I've got two inner describes. I've got one inner describe which is just focused on the home page, what I call the Discover Movies page, and I've got another nested describe block which is just focusing on the movie details page. And if we look at, let's say, this it block here, now the purpose of this it block is to just check. I want to check that the Discover Movies header appears on the page. And I also want to check that there are 20 cards on the page. So if we just take this statement here, I'm doing a CY get of H3. So maybe if I just go back again to my browser. So the tests I want to do is I want to check, close off the developer tools. I want to check that this header here is appearing on the page. And I want to check that there are 20 of these cards appearing as well. So the first thing I have to find out is what's the piece of HTML that generates this Discover Movies page. So if I open up my developer tools again, and I click on this icon here, and I bring the mouse over and I select it, and I can see on the right that it's a H3 element. That's the first thing I've discovered. And so if I go back to my test code, I've got a CY get, and I'm saying get an element of type H3. Now it turns out that I think there are a couple of them. There's more than one. So this expression is actually going to return an array of H3 elements. But I'm qualifying it and I'm saying I'm only interested in the element that contains this text. And so that entire expression is just going to pick out one element in my page. Now, I don't have any expectation following on from this. Sometimes in Cypress, all you're interested in is determining that a particular element is appearing on the page. And that's the case for this line of code. So hopefully, if this line of code executes successfully, then that's telling me that my Discover Movies header is appearing on the page. So at least that's working. This statement here, this is a proper, I suppose, let's say, statement in that it has a command part. I talked about Cypress commands yesterday. It has a command part and it has an expectation part. The command part, its intent is uh, to find, well, let's look at it literally. It's saying find all the DOM elements that has this CSS class. Remember, if it begins with a dot, it means I'm referring to a CSS class. So I'm looking for all the DOM elements, elements that have the CSS class MUI. Let's just zoom it up a little bit. Uh, MUI card header dash root. So where did I get that CSS class from? Clearly, it's a CSS class that was generated by the Material UI library. But if I go back to here, And again, I use this trick of selecting, and maybe if I mouse over just this here, and if I look at the divs here, they all have classes that begin with MUI. Now, one of them is MUI card header. There it is there actually, MUI card header root. I could actually have picked a number of different classes because there's quite a number of them available to me here. But I just picked MUI header root as a class. And that class, which is part of a div, is related to one card. But there should be 20 instances of that class appearing on this page. And, if I looked at the rest of it, I would find those. So back to my code. I'm saying get all of the elements that have this as its CSS class. I know that there should be 20 of them, and that's what I'm stating here as my expectation. I'm stating that the length of the array, because this is going to generate an array for me, the length of the array should be 20. Yeah. So for me anyway, as a base test, if these two statements are successful, then that's telling me that just the very basics of my home page are displaying on the screen. And I could have picked any other, I could have written this test any number of ways, but this is just one way. If I move down to this here, this is, sorry, I'm not interested in the before block. This it block here is a base test for my movies detail page. And so what I decided was, let's go to the movies detail page. I decided I was going to look to see that the movie title is actually appearing on the page. I'm going to check that this piece of text appears on the page. And I also check that these chips appear on the page. And again, I could have picked other parts of the page as well. I could have picked to check to see that this paragraph, not sure if I do or not, does this text appear on the page? So let's go back to my code. Now, if I look at the before block this time, actually, so this before block is going to run before uh, any of the it blocks, but the before block is only going to run once. Now, what am I doing in the before block? I'm actually making a HTTP request, which you can do with Cypress as well. So this statement here is making a HTTP request to my TMDB uh, uh, API. Maybe I should go back a little bit actually. I have to go back to here now at this stage. Go back to the very top and go look at this before block here. This before block executes once for this entire file. And really what I'm doing in this before block is I'm actually sending a request to TMDB and I'm asking it for 20 movies from its Discover endpoint. Yeah, you can see here I'm sending a request to the Discover endpoint of TMDB. That should return 20 movies to me. And in Cypress anyway, this is the way I can actually extract just the body of the response. So the body of the response from this HTTP request, the body should be my array of 20 movies. And I'm just storing those I'm storing the 20 movies in a local variable called movies, which is just declared at the very top here. And I haven't initialized it. So after this before block executes, this movies variable should be pointing at an array of movie objects. Going back down to here. Here I'm sending a request to TMDB again, but I'm picking out, in this case, I'm asking it for details about a particular movie. So the endpoint is slightly different. Okay. And I've just arbitrarily decided it's the very first movie in the array, index 0, and I'm getting its ID. So this request is requesting the full details on the very first movie in the array of Discover movies. And again, I'm just extracting the body and I'm storing that detail in a local variable called movie, which is also declared at the top of my file here. So if you like these two variables here, movies and movie, they are my kind of test data for this particular test spec. Let's go back to here. So this test is about focusing on the movie's detail page. So I grab the details of a particular, am I looking at the right one? Sorry, beg your pardon. This test here is focusing on the movie's detail page. And I've just arbitrarily chosen one movie, which is the very first one in the array of movies that has been returned to me. I also, here I visit. See why that visit will force the browser to navigate to this particular page on in my app, and I'm navigating to movies and whatever the ID of movie 0 is. In other words, if I go back to here, go back to my home page, close off the tools for a second, go back to my home page and navigate to this one here. Okay, that's where it should navigate to as it's running my tests. Back to look at my test. So I've navigated to it, and now I've got my actual test spec, if you like. And in the test spec, I'm looking for certain things on the page. I'm looking for a H3 element that contains the actual movie title. I'm looking for a H3 element that contains the text overview. I'm looking for, well, if we just take those two first, okay? And let's just take this one here. How did I know that the movie title is contained within a H3 element? How did I discover that? Well, using that technique that I'm showing you. So if I open up my developer tools and click on Select Elements tab, click on this, bring the mouse over the part that you're interested in, which is this part here, click it, and you can see on the right that it is a H3 element. Now, this overview is also a H3 element. So there's more than one. So going back to my code, when when the cy.get h3 executes, that's going to return an array. But I'm saying from that array, I'm only interested in the H3 that contains the particular movie title. And so that should pick out, if the page is rendering properly, that should pick out this bit here. The next statement is much simpler. Uh, Pick out the H3 element that contains overview. The next one is a little bit trickier. Now, the intent of, let's see. Oh, yeah. So the intent of this line here is to ensure that the movie overview text is actually appearing on the page. By that, I mean that this text here is actually appearing on the page. So I'm back to my problem. Well, what type of DOM element does this text appear in? And so I have to discover that. So it's quite slow process. So if I click on this, and you can see on the right, it's a paragraph element. So go back to here. How did I express it? I said, first of all, uh, get all the H3 elements, take the next element after each of the H3s, and see, does that next element contain the movie overview text? Um, Now, you could have argued, why did you not just say get a paragraph that contains that? And I think that would have worked as well. Rather than looking for a H3, I could have said look for a paragraph, but there may be other paragraph elements in the page. I can't remember whether there were or not actually. Um, so maybe if I just try and explain how I came up with that. And if I select this again, click on overview. All right, click on overview. So overview is a H3 element here. And the next element after this H3 element is a paragraph. So that's why I came up with the use of the next command. Uh, and it was just for illustration purposes, just to give you an example of using the next command. So this H3, its next element is a paragraph. There are a number of H3 elements in the page. For example, this is a H3 element, but this H3 element does not have a its next its next element after it doesn't contain any text. So okay, and this one here. Sorry, have I? Oh, sorry. Let me just recheck that now again. Okay. Okay, so what's going on here? Now, the intent of what I've highlighted there, the intent is to find the genre chips, which is these guys here, and check that the right texts are appearing in the genres that are being listed here. And it's really the same problem. I have to first of all discover what DOM elements are actually displaying these. And we're back to this technique of trying to find them. And it turns out that they're LI elements within a UL list. If I click the UL list, you can see what it's highlighting there on the left. The element just before that is a paragraph, which is my overview text. And if I go back to my code, that's what I'm expressing. I'm saying get a paragraph, get all the paragraph elements or element in the page. That it turns out that there is only one. find the next element after that, which is my UL list. Within is a command that allows me to process the element that has been picked out by this, as in I want to look within the element that has been picked out, which as we've seen is a UL element. And this code here then, so it looks like that what it's processing are the LI elements that make up the various genres. Now, I'm not interested in the first LI element because the first LI element is this one here, and that's static. I'm only interested in these ones, which are dynamic. Dynamic in the sense that the text that they contain will differ from movie to movie. And I have to find I know what they should be because I've actually retrieved the full details of the movie from TMDB. So I know what those strings should be. And really all I'm doing inside here is um, I'm iterating over them. I'm iterating over them using the each command to see if they contain the right value. Okay, I will admit that it's it has been particularly complicated by the inclusion of Material UI because Material UI has added a lot of HTML to my page. Then writing the actual Cypress code to find elements within a page has been complicated by that. Okay, so you might need to spend a little bit of time studying this code to get a sense of it. The other thing I would say is if I go back to my test execution and let's rerun the favorites test. If I just click, how do I rerun them? Does that do it? Let's do it this way. So what you see here is the you get a kind of an audit trail of the test execution. Now, this is it in kind of summary form. What you're seeing here are the strings that I've passed to my describe blocks and my it blocks. So the favorites page, sorry, the favorites feature there, that's coming from the describe block. If I go into the favorites one, all right, favorites. Okay, keep going. The favorites feature, so that there corresponds to the favorites feature. This here, selecting favorites, that comes from the it block, I guess. Oh no, it's actually the inner describe block. This here, the text of the it block is this here. But I can actually, if I click on them, I can expand them. And it shows me the full spec step by step. So let's say we pick out if we go back to the movie's detail page, if we go back to the base tests, go back to here, and we had let's say this one here, the movie's detail page. If I expand this, So what you're seeing here, this corresponds to, go back to the base test and the it block. Corresponds to kind of what you're seeing here. So if we take that, displays the movie title and overview. So if we go back to there, go back to here, let's see. The movie's detail page displays the movie title and overview. And if we scroll down as far as, let's say, which one will we pick? Let's take this one here. Now I've essentially, when I click that, it kind of pins it, and on the right it shows you what the state of the browser page is at this particular stage in the execution of your test. Now what I'm doing here, if I look at the code, I'm jumping around a little bit now, but if I go back to the code, we're talking about this statement here. Let me just check which one is it now. Is it the other one? Sorry, no. Why isn't that working? This is the one I want, actually. That one there. Now I've pinned that. If I look on the right, it's highlighting, backlighting the movie overview. And that's the element that was picked out when this particular part, this statement here, was executed in my spec. And this statement here corresponds to this statement in the code. So, you can actually look at the step-by-step execution of your spec. That's what you can do here. You can kind of go back in time and step through the execution just to see what elements are being picked out as it's working its way through your test execution. Okay, it just takes a little bit of time, really. I guess is what I'm trying to get across to play around with this example that I'm giving you in the labs. So eventually, if we just go back to our slides, where we started with all this was the fact that you can use Chrome's dev tools to discover the actual piece of HTML that has been generated by React and Material UI in our case. That combination, what actual HTML has it generated from the various parts of your page. And knowing the HTML, that will enable you to write your Cypress code. This time travel thing is what I was showing you. Once you ran your tests, you can pin different parts of the test code, and by pinning it, you're essentially freezing the UI on the right at that particular stage in the test execution and find out then what part of the page is it focusing on. So for example, when I pinned this statement here, it was actually about to select the heart icon um, on this particular page, which is the home page. Right, that's the interactive test runner, the Cypress interactive test runner, and that's what you would need to play with initially as you're building up your test code. The other test runner that Cypress provides is what's called a headless test runner. And uh, what it does is it actually just runs through all of your test cases or your test specs without actually opening up the GUI tool at all. And this is particularly useful if you want to run your Cypress tests as part of a CI/CD pipeline, because when you're running them within a pipeline, you don't have any browser available to you. So to run the headless version of the test runner, this is the command that we type. And so if I do that, I'm going to actually shut down my GUI, although I don't have to, but if I shut that down, go back to VS Code, now at the moment now I've got my dev server is still running, which we can see here. That's my dev server, it's still running. And if I go back to the other terminal and just type the command npm cypress run, npx, sorry. When I hit return now, it's going to run each of these test specs one by one. Now the filtering one is actually going to fail, but that's okay. But let's just see it in action. So what the test is actually doing is it's communicating with my localhost 3000 web server, sending requests to it, essentially stepping through each of these test specs one by one. It doesn't actually have to open up a browser instance at all. It essentially kind of runs a browser internally. Okay, it's still working its way through and it has completed, and we can see by way of summary, all of the base tests were successful. All of my favorites test spec were successful. There was an error in the filtering, which is this one here. And the navigation one was successful. So that's what's called this headless test runner. And as I said, it's ideal for running your Cypress tests within a CI/CD pipeline, which turns out to be part of assignment 2. You can get it to generate video recordings of the execution of these tests and store those. You can essentially kind of distribute those video recordings amongst the team members. By default, the video recordings is turned off. There's lots of command line options available to you when you're either running the headless mode or the GUI mode Now, for example, you can tell it to, you only want it to run a specific spec file, or you can specify a pattern to run a subset of your spec files. You see there, when I didn't give it any options, it ran all of them. So maybe sometimes we don't want to do that. This minus minus config option can be useful. If I just go back to VS Code, there is this file which I haven't mentioned so far, the Cypress configuration file. This one here. Let me just collapse that. This is the Cypress configuration file. It's actually just a JavaScript file. And there are a number of settings that you can enable in this file. There are very few of them in this case. We're taking the default values, but this is an interesting one here where you're specifying the URL that the web application is accessible from. Now, because I'm running my Movies app from the command line on this desktop machine, then the domain name is localhost, and I started my Movies app on port 3000. So I'm telling Cypress where exactly it should send um, it should access my application from. Now that's important because if I look and go back to one of my sample tests, if I go into this one here, when we when it executes this line here, visit the home page, it has to know, well, where is the home page? What domain name, what URL should I use essentially, and what port number should I use to access the home page? And it's getting that from the configuration file that I was just showing you. So for example, if I try and mess it up intentionally, if I go into this configuration file and let's say change it to port 3001, save that, go back and run my GUI client. And I'll just run the base tests. Then I'm getting red bar. And if we looked at the detail of why it's complaining, you can find it inside here. It's essentially getting a 404 response when it tries to execute the visit, telling me that if you read the detail of, if we scroll right up, it's this visit is where it is throwing the exception from. Okay, and if you just read through it, it's kind of explaining that it can't find that destination. It's making the TMDB call okay, that's working fine, but the other one, the visit command, isn't working. Now I changed it there by going into the configuration file. But if you use this minus minus config option at the command line, in other words, if you're doing in headless mode, you can put in your minus minus config option here and specify a configuration setting, for example, the base URL setting. And whatever you specify it to be here, that will override what it is in the configuration file itself. So that can be useful. Okay. These are just some other options. The minus minus record is telling it to generate video recordings of the execution of your test. The minus minus browser option. These are all options now that you can specify up here. The minus minus browser option allows you to specify what type of browser it should use when it's running your tests in headless mode. So they're all quite useful, but arguably this is one of the most useful ones. Just very quickly, commands. The way actually Cypress runs, if this is my test spec, okay, it's a very simple one for the little to-do app that we were talking about yesterday. And when Cypress runs this test, it doesn't start here and execute this and then execute this and then execute and work its way through it sequentially. What it actually does is it generates a queue of all of the commands that make up your spec. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to represent here. Generates the a queue for each command in my spec, and then it goes back and it starts with the first entry in that queue. And if that entry fails, it will actually retry it. It will retry it, which is kind of what I'm representing here. It'll retry it a number of times. Now, eventually, it will give up if every time it tries to execute a command, it retries it a number of times, and still after a number of retries, it fails. Then obviously, Cypress will give up at that stage. But it does actually retry a number of times. And for example, that can be very useful because the visit command, for example, is trying to make a HTTP request. So it's an asynchronous request, and it will take time to get the response back from that request. Uh, and so that's why the retry can be useful. But the other commands, it retries as well. And that can be beneficial because the browser has to generate the DOM data structure internally. And for very complex pages, generating the DOM can take time. So equally, Cypress will retry the execution of each of these commands as well a number of times. And that kind of that means of execution ensures that every time you run your tests, you're guaranteed to get the same results. Because on some occasions, the visit may be particularly slow, but because the retry is happening, you're guaranteed that it will eventually get through. Similarly, the browser execution or construction of the DOM, the timing of it may be slightly different from execution to execution, but because there's retries happening, then you're pretty much guaranteed that eventually your tests will run the exact same way every time. So that's the nice thing that's just built into Cypress, and it's kind of there for free if you like. All I'm saying here is, Cypress or Cypress code is using this method chaining programming style, and I spoke about that yesterday. So this is an example of a chain of commands, and each command, I'm saying here, each command um, returns what's called a subject. So the cy.get, that returns a subject. Now, the subject could be a reference to one particular DOM element or an array of DOM elements, but the next command in the chain executes on that subject. And that's just the way, again, it works kind of internally. We can act on a subject directly. Oh, yeah. Sometimes you may want to actually take the element and do some more detailed processing of it. In that case, there is this then command, which is a bit like the promises then command that you'd be familiar with from asynchronous programming. Do I have an example of it there? I don't. There are examples of where I use the then command within my samples that I've given you for this week's lab. Well, I'm showing you an example here actually. Get a div, then get let's say there are a number of divs in my page. I'm getting the third one because it starts at index 0. Within the third div, I'm looking for a button. And once I've got that element, I'm then invoking the then command and I'm passing it essentially a callback. I'm passing it a function. But this is where I can actually now manipulate the button that has been picked out here. And so, for example, I might want to get the CSS classes that are attached to that button and do some processing of those, whatever that might be. This is all within a test now. Okay, you can read over the summary yourself. So um, uh, the difficult part really of Cypress, to be quite honest, is to examine the HTML and from that then to work out how you would express your testing code using Cypress commands. And there isn't a right answer and a wrong answer. You know, there are many different ways that you might express in your test code how to pick out a particular DOM element. And whatever works, works really. It's as simple as that. There isn't a right way and a wrong way, or a good way or a bad way. It's however way you want to express your commands to pick out a DOM element. If it works, then well and good. So you should let's close off that for now. You should, if we go back to the website, you should work your way through this lab and study the Cypress code that I'm giving you for it, and also try and relate the Cypress code to the actual uh, HTML associated with the particular page that the Cypress code is testing. Which brings us on to the final topic, and that is assignment 2. So in assignment two, I want you to build a CI/CD pipeline for a web app. And I'm giving you the web app here. So let's just first take a quick look at this web app. And you'll be glad to hear now that it's much, much simpler app than the movies app. And do I have it loaded here? Okay, so it's a classic to-do app. If I just start it up first. Before I do that, I should shut down the other one actually, because they both use port 3000. Okay, this is your pretty standard to-do app. And how do we do it? How do we play with this app? We just type in our to-do. So let's say do assignment, click create. It adds it to my list here. Let's add another to-do. Go to lecture, click create. Okay, and so it just lists the to-dos. It's showing you here how many you have, how many you've created, and how many you've completed. By completing, we just tick this checkbox, and this changes over here. Now I've one of two completed, and if I want to delete it to do, I just click on the trash bin icon and it deletes it. Okay, that's it. There are no other pages. That's the functionality. This app was generated with React. Now, you'll be glad to hear it does not use Material UI. It just uses a much more straightforward CSS library called Bootstrap. But, again, open up the developer tools and you'll see the detail. So let's say if we take this button here, what does that correspond to? Surprise, surprise, it's a button. So just spend a small little bit of time exploring um, the HTML. But as I said, it's much more straightforward than for the Movies app. Let's just enter this again. Do assignment. Create. So now if I want to, let's see, what's this here? Anyway, you can play around with it yourself just to discover the HTML. So that's my app, and I want to build a CI/CD pipeline for it. Go back to the assignment. My CI/CD pipeline is going to have these stages. Now we'll just skip over the build stage for a second. I'll come back to that. Uh, the packaging stage is where the packaging stage will create a Docker image of the to-do app. Now I'm giving you the Docker file. Here it is here. You can look at it if you want to. It's actually slightly complicated because it's what's called a multi-stage Docker build, Dockerization of the React app. But there's no need to go looking at it really. You can just take it that it works. And we know how to build Docker images, given that we have the Docker file. So that stage, what I'm calling the packaging stage, is pretty straightforward. You really already have that code from that pipeline code from last week's lab. The staging stage. I'm telling you down here, if we scroll down, staging stage is where you deploy. I should say as well, in the packaging stage, you need to publish your image into your Docker Hub account. But again, we've done that in last week's lab. The staging stage requires you to deploy this to-do app onto an EC2 instance. And you can use the exact same EC2 instance that you created for last week's lab. And you have the GitLab CI/CD pipeline code to do that deployment. So you can literally copy and paste that into this pipeline. You do need to set up some environment variables. Can I just also just make you aware of, if I go over to my AWS account, I want to close those off actually. So here's my AWS account, and if I go into the EC2 section, and select instances. And here's the instance that you would have created last week. Now, I did advise you, I hope you followed the advice. I did advise you to stop the instance once you're not using it. Otherwise, you're incurring costs. Um, to restart it, you just select it. And in the uh, instance state drop-down menu, you just select start. And it restarts that instance for you. Now, you do need to be aware every time you stop and start an EC2 instance, it gets a new IP, sorry, it gets a new, IPv4 address every time. Okay. And we know how to find the IPv4 address. Just go into the networks tab down here and it'll tell you what the IPv4 address is. Okay, there's none here now because my instance is currently stopped. But again, just be aware of that fact that when you stop it and restart it, it's going to have a different IPv4 address. That's relevant because the IPv4 address is one of the environment variables, if you remember, that you had to set up for last week's CI/CD pipeline. Okay, back to the spec. So I would argue that the the packaging stage, you know how to write that. The staging stage, you know how to write that. The next thing is the next stage is the what I'm calling the EC2 testing stage. And so the idea there is that if you read the yikes, where did that go to? Okay. In the EC2 testing stage, you'll be running your Cypress tests. Now, I would advise you to write your Cypress tests and run them locally first. So just start up your to-do app locally using npm run dev and start up your Cypress GUI and just run your tests from there. And really, you only need one test spec file, and you can put all of your testing code into one file. There's no need to have multiple files like I did for the movies app. But run, obviously, I guess it would be fairly obvious that you would ensure that your tests run locally first. And once you've satisfied yourself that they do, then you will add a EC2 testing stage to your pipeline. But in this case, the EC2 tests will be running against the version of the to-do app that you have deployed onto your EC2 instance. So clearly it's going to have a different address from the local host address. Yeah. So that's the EC2 testing stage. It runs your Cypress tests within the pipeline. It's running them in headless mode because you don't have an actual physical browser, if you like. That's number one. And number two, the target, if you like, for those tests will be your to-do app that's running on your EC2 instance. And I do tell you up here actually that you should run it on port 3000 on your EC2 instance. But again, you should know how to do that. Now, just in relation to running Cypress tests as part of a GitLab pipeline, if I just go down to here, I'm giving you actually some code that you need to include in your pipeline. So let's supposing we've got these two fictitious stages, stage A and stage B. They're going to be different for your case. Obviously, they're going to be the build, packaging, EC2, build, packaging, staging, etc., etc. You do need to declare these two variables in order to run your Cypress tests. So you can just cut and paste those. You will have other variables as well, but you do need these two. You need this caching section as well. So again, just cut and paste that code and put it into your pipeline. And here's the bit that shows you how to kind of set up, if you like, a stage to run your Cypress tests. And in particular, I'm telling you, look, this is the image that the stage should use, the Docker image that the stage should use. And this image contains the Cypress framework installed in it for you. So you can run npx cypress run uh, minus minus browser Chrome. So do run your tests in a Chrome browser, albeit in headless mode. And you can pass other options as well. And particularly, you may well be passing the minus minus config option, for example, here. So I'm giving you this code. Uh, excuse me. Otherwise, you would have to actually discover, well, what image should I use for running my Cypress tests? And I'm giving you that. So that's back to my EC2 testing stage. The last stage, deployment. The idea there is that you are, Maria, anyway, deploying your application for use in production. Okay. And if you read the detail that I give you on that deployment stage, I'm saying that you will be deploying the To-Do app, uh, a second instance of it onto your EC2 platform. Now, the staging instance will be running off port 3000. Uh, the production instance will be running off port 80. I think I was just telling you here, right? Just use port 80 for that. So there'll be two instances of your to-do app container running on your EC2 instance, one using port 3000, the other using port 80. Uh, Additionally, I'm telling you here that this deployment stage, it needs to handle both continuous delivery and continuous deployment. You might remember when I was talking about CI/CD in general, continuous delivery. The idea there is that the deployment of your application into production had to be done as part of a manual step in the CI/CD pipeline. Now, I purposefully did not tell you how do you configure a stage such that it's a manual stage rather than an automatic stage. So you do need to discover that by reading up a little bit on GitLab. That's continuous delivery, where the deployment of your application into production is a manual step in your CI/CD pipeline. Continuous deployment is where the deployment of your app into production is automatic, which is the kind of standard type of pipeline stage. The standard type of pipeline stage is one that runs automatically. A manual pipeline stage has a certain setting or a configuration setting that makes it a manual job, if you like. But you have to discover how do I make a job a manual step rather than an automatic step. And I'm also saying that continuous delivery, that is deployment of the to-do app to your production environment, that should only happen when a push happens to the develop stage of your repository, which I talk about here, right? It's only when a git push to the develop branch of your repository, when that happens, then the manual deployment to the production environment should kick in. Whereas if there is a git push to the main branch of the GitLab repository, that should result in an automatic deployment of your to-do app into the production environment. So again, you're going to have to work out, how do I actually achieve that? So there are a number of challenges to getting the deployment stage working in accordance with how I've specified it here. Now there's one stage I skipped over, which is the build stage. And I need to explain something to you about uh, this app. So this to-do app, it's created using React, but I'm not using the Create React App build tool, which is the build tool that you would have been using in the web app dev. Instead, I'm using a build tool called Vite, V-I-T-E, okay? And you can see there is a Vite configuration file down here as part of my project. And in fact, the movies app that I've given you, the version that I've given you for this week's lab, it's actually using Vite as well. And you can see there's a Vite configuration file down here. Now, whether you are using Vite or the Create React App tool as your build tool for your React app, uh, what you can do with a React app, uh, if we just, let's stay with here with the Movies app, which you're more familiar with. So when I want to run my Movies app in dev mode, then the command I type is npm run dev. In the web app dev 2, you would have been typing npm start. Did that type correctly? It did, yeah. Npm run dev. Now, when I hit return here, what happens is the Vite tool starts up a web server, what we call a development web server, and it uses that web server to serve my movies app. We've done that, so if I hit return, it's starting up a special web server that's included with Vite. The same thing happens with Create React App. It has its own web server built in as well. And the web server is running on port 3000 locally. That's fine. Now, this development web server, though, that's really not any use to me when I want to run my React app in a kind of production environment. I have to use a standard web server. But what I also have to do is to create a production version of my React app that I can deploy to that web server. And the web server that we happen to be using for the to-do app is Nginx, and we've come across Nginx before, because if I go back and look at the Docker file for my to-do app, you can see that it's using Nginx. Okay. But I've got to supply my Nginx web server with a static version of my React app. And so how do I create a static version of my React app? Uh, with Vite, the way you do that is, if I stop this for a second, if I go npm run build, And actually, before I do that, I'm going to get rid of this folder up here. What npm run build, what that script is going to do is create a what I'm calling a static version of my React app. And you can see it has created a folder up here called dist. And I could do the same with the movies app. Let's do it with the movies app. Let's stop my development server if it allows me. So is there a dist folder? No, there isn't. So if I go npm run build, nothing there now. Let's see. Let's just do that again. Okay, I think I know what's happening there now, actually. Let me just confirm it though. Okay, there's lots of build time errors, which I'm not really that interested in. Let's just work with the to-do app because it looks like the build works successfully for me there. So here's the in the it's dist folder is what I'm calling a static version of my React app. And if we drill down into it a little bit, there's an assets folder, and so there's an index.html, which you can see here. So that was this index.html was generated by the Vite tool for me, and it's a standard HTML. It has a reference to a script file, which you can see here. And the script file it's referring to is contained inside in this assets folder. And if we just pull this over a little bit, uh, you can see that there are two files in the assets folder. There's a JavaScript file. Now, this JavaScript file contains all of my React code after it has been compiled. We didn't look at the code for the to-do app. There isn't really any need. We don't need to do that, but there are lots of components there, all written in React. Yeah. But uh, these files contain React code and JavaScript code, and all of that React code has to be converted into standard JavaScript. And all of that JavaScript has to be put into one file. And in this case, it's this file here. Okay, so believe it or not, this is all JavaScript code, the entire JavaScript code for my to-do app. And it has been minified and compressed for efficiency purposes. So the static version of a React app is comprised of a standard HTML page, a file, a JavaScript file that contains the entire code for your React app, and a CSS file that contains any custom CSS associated with your React app. And this static version now, that can be used with a standard web server like our Nginx web server. And even though I don't really want to look at the detail of the Docker file, but if we look at the Docker file, that's kind of what we're doing. We're running npm install to install the dependencies. We're running npm run build to build our static version of our to-do app. And okay, there's some slightly complicated stuff happening here, but we're essentially making that the dist folder. Is there any way we can show? Let's see. Um, we're actually copying the dist folder into the Nginx uh, base folder for all of its website. Okay. Um, so where did we? So yeah, go back to my pipeline. In this build step, what I want you to do is to essentially create a static version of your to-do app and just make sure that it's building properly. Okay. Now, of course, you're not changing any of the React code, so it definitely will build properly. I just built it for you there in a moment ago. So that's going to work fine. But I want you to do that within the pipeline. So essentially, and I'm telling you here, right? Essentially, the pipeline job, the build pipeline job is going to need to execute this sequence of build scripts. Okay, so this is the exact script that will be contained within the build job. Has to run npm install to install all the node dependencies, that being React and React DOM. We didn't look at the package.json, but if we just go back and look at package.json for a second, you know, there's where are the dependencies? There we go. React, React DOM, React Bootstrap, which is a much simpler alternative to, sorry, not React Bootstrap, React Icons. There should be, I thought Bootstrap was being used, but maybe it isn't being used. And either way, they're just some third-party dependencies. So we need to run npm install, then run npm run build within your CI/CD pipeline job. And all I'm doing here is I can do that here actually. Let's go back to here. So I've built a static version of my to-do app and it's contained inside in this folder. Now, how do I prove to myself that this static version is actually working? And one way I can do it is to run a simple web server locally here and point it at that dist folder. Now, there are a number of web servers that I could use. What I'm showing you in the assignment specification is if you run a server called serve, okay, so if I just copy this command here, what this is going to do is run a standard web server, the serve web server. I'm going to point it at my dist folder and I want the server to listen on port 3000. And maybe I'll change it to 3001. Doesn't really matter. So let's just copy that. The last part here, the at symbol, sorry, the and symbol means to run this command in background mode. That would be very important when you're running this series of commands within a pipeline job. Because if we don't run our server in background mode, then that means any command after it in the job script won't be able to execute. So, but to demonstrate it locally, I can run it in foreground mode. So if I copy that, and I just want to check now, is there anything else running on port 3000? Let's see. Doesn't look like it. So I'll leave it run in foreground mode. And if I now just navigate to localhost 3000 in my browser, and do a manual refresh to make sure it's not something that it's cached. That seems to be working. Okay, so I'm picking up what it's showing me here now is the to-do app, which it got from the dist folder, which is a static version of my React app. And of course, if I go along and make changes to my React code, then those changes won't be immediately reflected in this view. I'd have to go away and create a new static version of the React app all over again. But we're not going to be changing the React app at all, so that doesn't really apply. So where are we? Back to my assignment spec. Um, so I've just been describing this build stage, and I've actually made in the grading spectrum, I've made getting the build stage working as something in the upper part of the grading spectrum, as we'll see in a second. So again, the packaging stage, everybody should be able to achieve that because you have it from the lab 2 weeks ago. The staging stage, everybody should be able to write that pipeline job because you have it from last week's lab. The E2E testing, first of all, you're going to have to write some Cypress tests for the to-do app. And again, just put all of the tests into one file. There aren't going to be a lot of them because there isn't a whole lot of functionality in the to-do app, but write them in a single Cypress spec file, run them locally using the Cypress GUI, and build up the Cypress tests a little bit over time. Don't try and write all of the code first, obviously enough, I guess. Once you've got some Cypress tests running, then try and add this stage to your pipeline and get that running. And finally, then add this deployment stage. Well, sorry, not finally. Add the deployment stage and maybe finally then add the build stage. So you can leave out the build stage initially in your pipeline just to make sure that you can get the other ones working. Certainly the packaging, staging, and E2E testing. So the build stage and the deployment stages are probably the last part of your pipeline that you'll try and get working. Okay, the grading spectrum, if you get packaging and staging working, you're in the 40 to 50 bracket. If you get the E2E testing working, you're in this 50 to 70 bracket. 70 to 85 is if you get the build stage and some of the deployment stage working, all of the deployment stage working actually. And if you're aiming for higher than that again, then what I'm saying is rather than deploying a production version of your app onto EC2, you could use a different platform called Vercel. There's actually an error in that. I need to correct that. There should be a hyperlink there that brings you to the Vercel platform. Vercel is a cloud platform that allows you to deploy React apps onto and other types of apps as well. But we're just interested in the React one. So you would have to read up a little bit on Vercel and how you would add Vercel as part of a GitLab pipeline job. But there's lots of online tutorials on that. The notes, I've already kind of spoken about those. This is just to help you with how you run Cypress tests as part of a GitLab pipeline. Okay, 11:02. So the lecture went on quite a lot, actually. I guess, you should first of all maybe do this week's lab, have a read over this, and by all means, come back to me with any questions that you might have. Now, I've essentially finished all of the material that I want to cover on this module, so there's no new material from here on in. There won't be any lecture next week. There won't be any new labs next week. Now, there is, of course, an assessment that will happen on week 13. I haven't finalized what format that is going to take. Right now, my thinking is it will be a lab-based exam that I need to somehow set up, given the restrictions in terms of network access, etc., that applies within the college. But I need to do some investigation on that before I can give you more details, and I will give you a lot more detail on that lab-based exam once I've finalized it. So, but that will be probably maybe early next week. For now, you've got plenty to work on anyway, particular this week's lab and the assignment. Are there any questions, I wonder, any immediate questions that you might have in relation to the assignment? You probably have read over it since I published it yesterday. Are there any questions that you have for me on it? No? Okay. So I'm going to stop there. I'll remain online for the next hour, uh, and I will be in touch with you later on uh, this week, maybe, and certainly next week. Okay, bye bye.